Hello and welcome to Europe and You. Coming up this time.
The knitters, writers and trainers warning Europe is putting them out of business. Why bison are more sensitive than they look. And in the studio...
There's nothing stopping
No.
the
That's
UK
the point
building on that.
There's absolutely nothing stopping the UK being the leader in any of these things.
Should the EU set new targets to save the environment?
Years after bombs were set off in 2 Birmingham pubs, a West Midlands MEP is calling for a new investigation. Julie Hambleton's sister Maxine was one of 21 people who died. Many more were injured. Now 2 families of the victims have turned to Europe to demand a public inquiry.
40 years have passed and no one is looking for or actively investigating for the murderers of 21 innocent people.
There has been a miscarriage of justice and maybe even more a deliberate effort by people within the British state to hide evidence and to hide the truth about the murder of British citizens on British soil. That cannot be allowed to lie, and it will not be allowed to lie.
Wastewater at more than a dozen sites across the country is polluted and breaking EU law. From Durham to Devon, water is alarmingly polluted and breaching the standards the UK signed up to more than 20 years ago. Now the European Commission has had enough and is taking the UK here to the European Court of Justice. That could ultimately see the UK being fined millions of pounds. The last government insisted it had invested in water treatment, but local MEPs say it hasn't been enough.
I think it's a great shame. I think this is one of the areas where the European Union has a big role to play in ensuring we have good quality water and good treatment of that water so that there aren't risks to the environment and to people. While I don't welcome ever the fact that the UK is taken to the European Court, I think that ensuring that there's an improvement in the situation sometimes means that the Commission has to take legal action to get the investment and the policy shifting.
A new university campus in Swansea, part funded by the EU, is nearing completion. The £450 million development will see the first set of students arrive later this year. Looking ahead 10 years or so, the Vice-Chancellor predicts it will have reinvigorated the region.
I think you will see hundreds of companies. You'll see the signs up there. There'll be multinational companies, there'll be small SMEs, there'll be local companies. A whole new high-tech cluster that's developed as a result of the activities around this campus.
In order to build such a big development, the university and the Welsh Government bid for EU money totalling around £100 million. Welsh Government Minister Jane Hart says the support of Europe has been vital.
We would not have that campus. We wouldn't see Swansea rising up the stakes in terms of research assessment and of course contributing to our economy in terms of local business.
Still to come.
The web entrepreneurs caught up in EU red tape and why bison need handling with care.
A major report has warned that unless more action is taken, the environment will suffer catastrophic damage. The European Environment Agency brought together data from across the continent, covering biodiversity, transport, pollution, material resources and much more. There have been some successes, such as reductions in greenhouse gases and improved water quality. But in the long term, according to the report, we're at risk of failure. So what do we do? Here to hopefully answer that question are 2 MEPs, the Conservatives' energy spokesman Ian Duncan and Liberal Democrat Catherine Bearder, who's a member of the Environment Committee in the European Parliament. Catherine Bearder, turning to you first. The report warns that things are generally bad and likely to get worse. From that point of view, what are the risks, that, as you see them, to the environment?
The risks are that we don't act quickly enough and that we don't enforce a lot of the legislation that we have got. Birds migrating across the Mediterranean is the most visible, but there are plenty of other legislation that we don't enforce.
And I mentioned that you're on the Environment Committee.
Yeah.
What kind of stories do you hear from people from across Europe, in the UK and elsewhere, that are examples of environmental problems?
I'm working on the air quality package at the moment. And there are 400,000 people across Europe die prematurely every year because of poor air quality. We have to do something about that. That's the same sort of figures as you've got from smoking.
Ian Duncan, are we making some progress when it comes to the environment, at least in some aspects? I mentioned, for example, greenhouse gases, which we have managed to reduce over the last couple of decades.
Well, we have made significant progress across a number of areas. And Catherine, of course, is right. It is about enforcement. And in the UK, we actually do enforce our laws very rigorously. And when that law is passed, we will try and meet it and try and exceed it if we can. That's not true across the rest of Europe. And I think one of the bigger challenges going forward is sometimes here in the European Union, when we do pass laws, they're lowest common denominator laws. They drive the standards down the way. And I don't think as a member state we should be solely reliant upon what is going on out here in the European Union. We too can make progress. We have a parliament, we have a government. We, if we wish to assert standards, we can do that right now. We don't need to come back to Europe to do it.
Okay, and I'll come in a minute to the kind of targets that Europe set. But Catherine, turning to some of the specifics of the report, one aspect they look at is habitats and species. 60% of living species, 77% of Europe's habitats could be under threat, according to this report. I mean, it does sound rather bleak.
It is frightening. What it did say is that we have made progress, but we are still living beyond the carrying capacity of Europe, let alone the planet. And that is something that we're all going to have to come to grips with. We had a tough negotiation in the last Parliament on the fisheries policy, because we had to say we have to live within a sustainable limit for the fish. We now have to be looking to doing that with the land, with the trees, with the birds, with the flowers, because we are pushing it so hard that at some point it will collapse. We know bees are really being hammered, and we've managed to stop the chemicals that were harming bees in a moratorium, but that could come back. And so much depends on some tiny little creature like the bee. If we destroy our environment, we will all suffer.
And do you think, therefore, that in order to achieve that, we need more targets from Europe? Is that something you'd like to see?
We have to get tougher. We have to raise the standard. As Ian said, we do tend to, in the European Union, set minimum standards because they have to be implemented in 28 different countries who are all at different levels of coping with this. Yes, we should be raising our standards.
But you'd like them set at a European level, would you? Tougher
Well,
standards?
yes, because birds and bees and flowers and trees don't respect borders. They move around.
And that's possibly where you disagree, Ian. Catherine would like to see tougher European targets. Would you agree with that?
Well, see, I would argue that many of those species do respect borders. The notion of pollination across the seas and so on is quite limited. Bees themselves are broadly British bees in that reality. What we've got to try and strike, and I think we often fail to do, is the balance between those who would use the environment, whether it be farmers or fishermen or indeed anyone else, and protection of the environment itself. There must be a sustainability. And I think quite often the European Commission strikes the wrong balance. So, for example, during the period when I worked for Scottish fishermen, not so long ago, they were seeking to bring about a recovery for the cod species. Now, that's very sensible. But their plan would have closed entirely the cod fishery. Now, you can't protect the cod if you kill the cod fishing industry, because what's the point in having fish after all with no fishermen to catch it?
And is there therefore a principle that you see of not putting too heavy targets on industry or whatever it might be, farming or fishing.
Sometimes you've got to get the balance right. And I think you can work in harmony. My goodness, over the years, farmers and fishermen and other land users have managed to do that. We've got to find the right balance between regulation, which makes sense, and regulation which supports industries to allow them to continue to do what they do, whether it be farmers or fishermen.
But Ian,
is that enough? Would that go far enough, Catherine Bearder, to save the environment when you look at a report like this where it says on current targets things might be gradually improving, but in the long term things look bleak?
But Ian was saying that trees don't pollinate across the seas. Most of Europe is not separated by seas. We're particularly lucky there, but ash dieback, swine disease, I mean, all sorts of foot and mouth, all came from somewhere else. And we need to be regulating for the whole of Europe. We need to be looking at forests for Europe. We need to be looking at food security for Europe. And it has to be pan-European.
Okay, well, it doesn't have to be pan-European. This is the point. When you look at some of the challenges you face in the UK right now, I don't necessarily want lowest common denominator protection that appeals to the lowest common denominator in the continent.
There's nothing stopping the UK building on that.
There's absolutely nothing stopping the UK being the leader in any of these things. You don't have to let it be done only here in the EU.
But the reality is that that's not happening, isn't it?
If you look at it, this is the point. Quite often, in fact, you end up having countries waiting for the EU to make progress, and quite often the EU simply doesn't make the progress. Okay. So, for example, in the Air Quality Directive, which you're working on just now, an important issue that's been stalled for a very long time, allowing member states to make no significant progress, which they should have made over the last few years, waiting for the
including the UK.
Indeed, waiting for the EU to solve all the problems.
But London has failed to meet the standards year after year after year.
That's the point, Catherine. They failed to meet the current standards. Setting new standards won't make them meet the current standards.
Because the pollution comes across the channel from France. So it's no good leaving municipalities to do it. We have to have a pan-European air quality because the air moves about.
We're already failing to meet the standards we currently have. Setting higher standards doesn't help us meet the current standards. Well, that's our problem.
Well, let's come to that then, because one of the things that this report highlights from the European Environment Agency, they say there are no targets beyond 2020 or 2030. So there's the objective of by 2050 that everything is lovely, and that the phrase they use is living well within the limits of our planet. But there's no way that's been set out of achieving that. Wouldn't at least setting European standards, European targets, be a way in that direction?
If you're telling me the environment should be a bit better, then I would agree it should be, but you're going to have to define to me exactly. If we're going to make a law, we have to understand what we're making business, industry, enterprise and individuals do. They have to be able to understand what's being asked of them. You can't simply say to them, it must be a little bit better.
We're behind the curve. You talk to businesses, Unilever, Coca-Cola, BMW, they are all moving ahead with the legislation, and they want us to lay that legislation down so that they have a level playing field. They can compete one to another. They are all recognizing that we cannot keep consuming at the rate we're doing without destroying the planet. They want that circular economy legislation, and they want it as soon as possible.
Okay, we're going to have to move on because we're running out of time. There's a couple of things I'd like to still ask you, though, Ian Duncan, is there a potential, the so-called green economy, is there a potential in becoming greener and getting benefits, that it doesn't have to be more targets is more problematic?
We need a holistic approach. I think talking about the green economy versus presumably the brown or the black economy is actually part of the problem. We sometimes simplify it, categorize it and pigeonhole it. Actually, what we're trying to do is make sure that we are sustainable in the way we approach our business and our industry, that we do no harm, that we also are able to see a future which is
deliverable. But Ian, we are doing terrible harm at the moment.
But the problem with terrible harm, and this is where we have a serious issue to look at, we've got to try and work out how it is that we take ourselves from where we are now to move forward.
Okay.
Now, if you bring in conditions which are so strict that no one can meet those conditions, you will create a problem. So it's a step change.
The aim by 2050, according to EU standards, is living within the means of the planet. But we're talking 35 years from now. From both your point of view, where should the priority lie? If that's the objective, what should be our priority to achieving that? Ian Duncan.
if you're talking about we in Europe living within our means, you've got to recognise now that we have a huge carbon footprint. The first world has the most significant carbon footprint. We rely upon imports from across the globe to satisfy our needs. We are a consumer world. Now we've got to recognise, if we want to live within our means, we are a globe, and this must be considered as a matter of addressing these issues at home. We can't simply keep consuming and buying. We are part of a bigger world, and if we can do that, there's a real chance we can make progress.
Catherine Beard, a final word to you. Your priority for achieving that goal?
It used to be that manpower was the most expensive element of any manufacturing industry. We're finding the shift now is moving to the resources. We have to value the resources that we've got. We can design in recycling, reuse, repair. Those are the three things that we need to be doing. We have to stop consuming at the rate that we are and using what we have got better.
Okay, thanks very much. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much, both of you, for joining me. Thank you.
A fantasy fiction author and an online trainer have been in Brussels to lobby MEPs not to put them and thousands of others out of business. Since the beginning of this year, web-based companies, from people selling digital knitting patterns to ebooks and videos, have had to pay tax according to the country where the customer lives. The rules were designed to try and close a loophole being abused by big corporations, but campaigners say it has been tripping up micro businesses because they won't necessarily know where their customers live, nor have the resources to complete all the extra paperwork.
Up until the 31st of December, if I sold an ebook direct through my own website, I paid 3.5% commission to PayPal, and I got to keep all the rest of the money. If I sell that book through Amazon, now 20% VAT comes off the top, then they take 30%, and then I get the rest. So it's had a significant impact.
I have 3 young children and I balance my business around being a mother. So I used to do a lot of my work helping people change their lives online through entry-level courses, through selling my books. I can't do that anymore because I have to stay outside of these rules. The administrative burden of deciding which of the 81 VAT rates to apply to every single sale is something I knew I couldn't manage. I didn't want to break the law, so I have had to scrap all the products that were affected by this legislation.
Politicians often talk about the digital economy becoming more and more important. Now they'll have to show that the rules they make won't hinder that potential. British bison farmers say their animals face unnecessary distress because of European rules. Farm animals like cattle and sheep must have their ears tagged so that the meat can be traced from farm to fork, and they have to be vaccinated against outbreaks like tuberculosis. But Conservative MEP Emma McClarkin believes that it's over the top to demand that bison farmers do the same. Now she's met with the EU's Health Commissioner in an attempt to convince him that bison should get an exemption.
They behave differently, they handle differently, they get very, very stressed. Despite their awesome size, they are actually a very sensitive animal, and so we need to make sure that whilst they're just being put in a bovine category, that actually they have the derogations they need to make sure that the animal welfare is taken into consideration, that the testing that they're using is not overly stressing them, and that they're handled as less as they possibly can be, because it is extremely stressful and sometimes can be fatal for our bison.
A UKIP MEP has been expelled from the party over an expenses scandal. A member of Janice Atkinson's staff was filmed allegedly attempting to inflate a receipt. According to the undercover footage, the assistant asked a restaurateur to write the total for a business lunch as £3,000 for a meal which apparently cost £950. Janice Atkinson has appealed against her expulsion and meanwhile continues to sit alongside her former UKIP colleagues within the Eurosceptic grouping in the European Parliament.
Well, that's all from this edition of Europe in You, but there's much more available both on our website and on social media. There's also the Europe in You app on iTunes. See you again soon. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.